Hello, colleagues. Hello, friends. Welcome to the OSUN Transnational Feminist Project lecture series. As usual, we are focusing on solidarity and social justice. And this is the last lecture of the series of this academic year, and we are really up for a treat. Because today we are going to hear about precarity and labor activism in academia from Professor Aslı Vatansever. We are going to be talking about feminization, but make it cool, academic labor activism. I'd like to say a couple of words about our speaker today. Aslı is a sociologist studying work and social stratification, focusing specifically on precarious labor and labor activism in academia. Aslı is currently a research fellow at Bard College, Berlin, and her work on academic labor activism has already appeared in prominent publishing outlets in the field of labor studies. So that would include journals such as Work, Employment, and Society. Aslı also published just recently a monograph entitled At the Margins of Academia, Exile, Precariousness, and Subjectivity in Braille, just recently, 2020. There is also an edited volume called Academic Freedom and Precarity in the Global North. And this is co-edited with our own Aysuda Coleman from Bard College, Berlin, who we all know. Just a couple of words, not really a spoiler, but maybe a trailer of what is up the menu today. So in today's talk, we have Aslı focus on the contested term of feminization, and we will hear about various conceptions about the term, as well as zooming in on its particular framing within the context of academic employment. There will be two case studies of academic labor activism, one coming from the United States called the Adjunct Advocacy Group, New Faculty Majority, and one comes from Germany, closer to home, the Circle of Precarious Researchers Network for Decent Work in Academia. And Aslı will illustrate the turn away from performative activism towards more of a relational groundwork. So there will be these two examples drawing upon which Professor Vatansever will propose to reframe the term feminization, that because it's usually connoted with less than positive meanings, but more of affirmative reframing of the term as a type of affective and relational mode of organizing. The argument here is that affective turn in academic labor activism heralds a feminization of resistance, and it's a term coined by our speaker today. And it's a new era for both academic labor activism and the new conceptual trajectory of the term feminization. Professor Vatansever, it's really exciting and honorable to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to your sharing your wisdom with us.
Elena, thank you so much for this very lovely introduction. And thanks for calling me Professor Vatansever. I will probably never get a professorship, but it's still nice to hear the word every once in a while, even if it's an illusion. But very sweet of you. Thanks a lot, Agata and Elena, for this kind invitation that I accepted very gladly. This is a topic very close to my heart and which features prominently in my work. And I have a personal interest in talking about this, not only because it affects me as a researcher, but also because I think it affects everything that we know about knowledge production in the 21st century. So we can never talk enough about academic precarity in all its different connotations. But today I will give it a little different twist with feminization and academic labor activism, and I hope that it will resonate with some of us at least. So as I said in my abstract, and as Elena also reminded us, and I said it elsewhere too, feminization remains a contested term within labor studies. It has multiple connotations, and most of them are rather negative, as I said. At least in recent times, it has been the case, or to be more specific, it has been the case after the term feminization started to be used in a qualitative sense, because initially it used to have a more neutral quantitative interpretation. It used to indicate a numerical increase in women's participation in anything, and starting with wage labor, of course. And later it gained a different meaning when people realized or remembered certain qualities inherent to women's work, or how it is valued, or rather how it is devalued in the labor market, or how certain qualities attributed to the historical construct of the feminine brimmed over women's wage labor and workplace experiences as well. And these qualities and forms of devaluation in the labor market that have been specific to women's work have not always been very positive, as we all know. So qualitative and critical framings of the term that came up later rather pertain to the type of employment contract or the labor process, and they highlight forced flexibility, low pay, lack of autonomy, and precariousness, or short, everything that has historically been associated with women's work so far. And as such, qualitative usages of feminization in the labor context often connote the disadvantages that women have been facing in the labor market for a long time, and still continue to do so, of course. But more recently, feminist scholarship has drawn attention to an increase in the influence and number of women activists in social movements as well, and that has given the term a more positive connotation. And well, we can, and I think we should, and in fact some scholars already do, add to feminization this qualitative element and associate feminized resistance with horizontal organizational structures and therapeutic reparative mode of action. And here the emphasis lies on the relational and affective traits that are traditionally associated with female subjectivities. And these intersubjective traits are now argued to inspire a distinct mode of collective action, especially in sectors dominated by precarious employment and lack of organized labor, that is the feminized sectors, if you will. And these are mostly the lower segments of the service sector or creative intellectual industries, as we all know. So today I want to talk about these different forms of feminization in academia with specific reference to academic labor. And ultimately, I want to focus on the dialectics of feminization. I will argue that the feminization of academic work calls upon a feminized mode of labor activism. And by that, as Elena already said, I have my gaze on non-hierarchical and counter-hegemonic solidary activities and collectivities, and less outcome-obsessed modes of action. That is a type of activism that derives from the repertoire of affective qualities that are usually attributed to the historical construct of the feminine. And when it comes to academic work, we actually see a similar trajectory of the term as its general usage in labor studies. On the one hand, you have this quantitative understanding of the term, and it denotes an increase in female faculty, especially in certain disciplines. Its qualitative framing, on the other hand, refers to various things and rarely to positive things. It refers to casualization of contracts, devaluation of academic work, and flexibilization and affectivization of the labor process, and so on and so forth. But I think before we delve into that, it's really important to note that even feminization, both in its quantitative and qualitative senses, it is still gendered in terms of its practical implications, right? It's not a neutral term, and not even in its negative qualitative interpretation, it's ungendered. Like, first of all, the quantitative feminization of the sector sounds really nice, an increase in the female faculty numbers, but it did not necessarily bring about gender equity. These are two different things. And second, when we talk about the qualitative framings of the term, we have to know that even qualitative feminization in all its negative connotations is not even distributed equally among male and female academics, right? I mean, female faculty is still more feminized than male faculty. I'm going to explain what I mean by that, but let's start with the quantitative part, which seems easier at a first glance. Now, there's an increased female participation in the academic sector. That's a fact. I mean, statistical data indeed demonstrate a clear tendency of quantitative feminization in academia, especially, since the second half of the 20th century. And the She Figures database of the European Commission, for example, even points to a near gender parity among doctoral graduates within the EU 27 and associate countries. And this sounds pretty straightforward and promising. But here's the thing. Quantitative increase in the female academic workforce does not necessarily mean that women share the same advantages or opportunities or even the same salaries as their male counterparts in the academic sector. Women are still systematically disadvantaged. And, for example, in Germany, or I guess in general within the European higher education area, the percentage of female professorial workforce is still about 25%. That means women are still overrepresented in the lower segments of the academic workforce, and they are systematically disadvantaged in terms of pay and upward career mobility. And, various mechanisms continue to perpetuate this situation. And that includes gender-based workplace misconduct, including sexual harassment, or gender-biased hiring and promotion procedures, and so on and so forth. So subsequently, you have a situation where there's a persistent lack of female faculty in the upper echelons of academic institutions. And on top of that, we still have a situation where women are often kind of compelled to congregate in the so-called feminine or feminized disciplines. And it is true, I mean, certain disciplines have indeed witnessed a demographic feminization over the last decades, which seems to be partly reinforced by their perception as feminized disciplines and vice versa. But even in those fields, like for example in sociology, and Patricia Roos has shown this in late 1990s in View of Sociology, even in such fields that are known as feminized fields, the quantitative majority of female staff has not resulted in a corresponding rise in the number of women in higher academic positions. Even in a sociology department, you still have, even though you have a majority of female faculty, you have a situation where men congregate in decision-making mechanisms and women do not have as many seats as their male counterparts within the decision-making mechanisms. And more importantly, we continue to encounter gender bias in terms of scientific and academic recognition. For example, there was a study from 2012 by Maria Domar Pereira, and it had this amazing title, Feminist Theory is Proper Knowledge, but that was the title of the article. And it drew attention to the fact that knowledge produced by female researchers, especially by feminist and gender scholars, is still viewed as flawed or partial, right? When we talk about sexism or gender discrimination, it's always partial. We're not objective. So this brings us kind of, back to the qualitative connotations of feminization in academia. And here, I think we should first distinguish between various forms and vectors. I basically see two different lines along which qualitative feminization in academia proceeds. There's this one that pertains to the academic labor process. And here, feminization is understood as flexibilization and maternalization of the workforce within the academic labor process that contains teaching and research, basically. By that, we mean that the academic workforce is increasingly expected to accommodate to students, be responsive and attentive beyond the regular curricular requirements, and we're expected to perform unpaid administrative, emotional, and academic labor to a great extent. And here, the emphasis lies on intersubjective qualities that are attributed to the feminine, such as adaptability, hypervigilance, timidity, or propensity to care work, etc., which I personally despise. And how these are utilized in the labor process, often to the detriment, yet with the complicity of the academic workers themselves, of course. And these are the same mechanisms that we see almost in every branch of creative intellectual sectors, actually. But in academia, you have this intrinsically motivational, self-sacrificial work culture, and you have this emphasis on on the sacred character of public service. So with these delusional work cultures that we have in academia, we are certainly more prone to the mechanisms of self-exploitation than any other field. Self-sacrificial love labor is actually our default mode of work, right? Rosalind Gill, in fact, even argues that contemporary managerial ideology that you see in other creative or white-collar sectors actually imitated the traditional academic work culture, which seems plausible if you think about it, because we have been working with this default work culture since the 19th century, since the consolidation of the German model research university that we know today. But in the meantime, here's another gender trick. There's this feminization of academic workforce in general, in terms of the labor process, that expects us to become more flexible and more maternal, and it affects the entire academic workforce. But female faculty, on top of that, is quite literally expected to mother the students and cater to their even most immature demands, or else we get terrible evaluations. There has been this study a couple of years back where it came out that female faculty is expected to be more, sweet and lovely and understanding towards students, or else they get punished in their evaluations, which means, male professors can afford to act like college professors, whereas we're expected to act like kindergarten teachers, especially in private teaching companies, like teaching factories, teaching like private colleges. And personally, I kind of sense a paradoxical tendency here in the overall maternalization of the academic workforce. I argue, and I said it in an article that I had published recently, I argue that the hypermaternalization in the workplace is accompanied by dematernalization in the private sphere. By that, I mean that we're often emotionally so drained from delivering this extra care and service work in the workplace that we have barely any energy left to invest in our private, intimate relationships. For example, Maria Ivancheva and colleagues have argued in an article that this causes also an additional relational intimate precarity, especially for female academics, meaning that precarious female researchers are doomed career-wise if they prioritize their intimate relationships, whereas they face a lifetime of failed relationships or involuntary childlessness if they invest all their emotional and libidinal energies into their careers. So we're doomed if we do, doomed if we don't, right? Which is rarely the case for male academics in heterosexual relationships, because they're allowed to be career-oriented and they're allowed to dump their domestic duties on their partners. And also, you never find a woman being threatened by her male partner's success, whereas the reverse is almost a universal thing, which we have all kind of internalized, right? Men are allowed to be threatened by your success, and you should be the one to downplay it in order to make them feel comfortable. So even feminization in the sense of materialization and flexibilization does not affect the entire academic workforce equally in terms of gender. The other type of qualitative feminization, on the other hand, is related to the employment relations. And here I understand feminization as contractual precarization. You know, the systematic decrease in public funding and the accompanying oversupply of PhDs in the last decades have created a huge reserve army of disposable academics, which are often called the academic underclass or the academic pariah, as opposed to the shrinking minority of the tenured academic aristocracy. And this positioning as underclass in itself is actually very much reminiscent of the historical position of the female workforce within the labor market, right? And this is, for example, how Eileen Boris and colleagues conceptualize feminization of academic work. They say that negative employment conditions such as insecurity and contingency, which used to characterize women's work in the past, have now become the norm in today's academia for everyone, which is true. But still, at this point, as I said previously, we have to emphasize that the burden of feminization in terms of intensified emotional labor or precarity is also distributed unevenly, with female faculty, of course, being once again disadvantaged. And this is due, in the first place, for example, to gender biased expectations I mentioned earlier, whereby both the student and the institutions demand disproportionately more service work and affective care from female faculty than is expected from male faculty. Or it's also due to sexist hiring and promotion practices, as well as masculinist performance demands. And by that, I mean the expectation from academic workers to be free of all care duties and reproductive concerns. And this is mostly the case for female faculty. I mean, female faculty suffers more from it because biologically speaking, your reproductive phase has a limit, which also happens to coincide with your career advancement phase, which can be very painful under circumstances. And even if you do meet those masculinist performance criteria, you might still continue to be invisible in academia. Like, for example, there was this great article by Teresa O'Keefe and Aline Courtois, where they described the female faculty as the non-citizens of academia. And by that, they meant that, female faculty are those who do all the groundwork and still do not get to have a seat, or at least as many seats as their male counterparts in the decision-making mechanisms. So apparently, even though the percentage of female researchers has increased over the last decades, and according to some scholars, this might even change the epistemological structures in certain disciplines and so on and so forth, which would be super nice. But in terms of substantive gender equity, we still have a long way to go, right? But here I would like to adopt a more optimistic tone, which is uncharacteristic for me. And I'm going to say that luckily, there are collective energies and attempts to embark upon that long way. And here, I specifically turn my gaze to precarious researchers networks and adjunct advocacy groups that emerged at first as anti-precarity movements, but soon they started to tackle broader issues that aggravate academic precarity, like gender inequality, ethical misconduct, feudal hierarchies, specifically in the German context, or classicism, racism and sexism in academia, all these entrenched structures that play into your career chances and affect or aggravate the impacts of precarity. And I would say through their distinctive mode of collective action, these anti-precarity initiatives, these precarious researchers networks, either deliberately or accidentally, they kind of changed the meaning of feminization as well. And as I said at the beginning, the term feminization has only recently started to be used within the context of social movements. And here, the quantitative conception of feminization was accompanied by an emphasis of how women's solidarity practices also reshape movement structures. For example, there have been accounts of the growing female influence in Venezuelan resistance practices, or the female actors' influence in the micropolitics of call center workers' resistance, etc. And these are all very valuable contributions to the discourse on labor activism. But interestingly, to my best knowledge, I may be wrong, but I did a very extensive search on that. There haven't been any takes on feminization in the context of academic labor activism, except for a recent article that I had published. I mean, I'm not saying this to brag, but it was just striking to see that no one has ever pondered the issue of feminization in the context of academic labor activism. That may be due to the fact that academic labor activism is rarely seen as labor activism. Even to get an article about academic labor activism into one of those labor journals is a huge fight, because you have people among the reviewers who have a hard time understanding that academics are workers too, and their struggles, their battles are also labor activism, because we tend to see ourselves not as workers, but something above and beyond wage labor. So these illusions also play into the limits of the discourse to a great extent. But there has been like a little exception, and they do not refer to feminization as such, but they draw on their experiences in adjunct organizing. There had been this article, or a set of articles in an edited volume, where Doe and colleagues have coined the term affective advocacy to denote a form of academic labor activism that emphasizes the conversational, reparative, and affect-led character of non-tenured advocacy groups. And even though they did not use the term feminization or academic labor activism in specific, that seemed to correspond to what I call feminization of resistance in the qualitative sense. And I understand it particularly in its affirmative connotation as counter-hegemonic relationality, or as something that challenges the masculinist ideals of outcome-oriented modes of action. And this is, of course, not a coincidence that we started to talk about this now, you know, these affect-led movements and horizontal movement structures and so on and so forth. Historically, it is totally in line with the general tendency towards affective politics. And in a way, the turn away from masculinist understandings of activism is probably related to the inefficiency of traditional forms of labor organization in the face of precarized, fragmented labor, right? And at the subjective level, conventional labor organizations like trade unions often fail to address, or they do not even have this on their radar, like the psycho-emotional implications of a work climate where the workers' own interpersonal skills and affective dispositions are turned against them, right? It's a very psycho-emotional process that you're undergoing, and it's not the trade union's place or goal to address these psycho-emotional intersubjective processes. And I think the affect-led types of labor activism emerge primarily to address these issues, or out of this need, because if it's primarily your cognitive and emotional capacities that are being exploited, resistance has to start from where exploitation takes place. right? That is your affective facilities and affective dimensions of work. And the very set of cognitive capacities that are prone to exploitation within the current regime of accumulation are precisely those that are associated with the feminine, like inclination to care work, adaptability, and responsiveness. And these are currently our facilities that work claims and colonizes. So these should be the cognitive capacities we use to organize resistance as well. We have to start where the system hits us, right? And knowingly or intuitively, contemporary academic labor activisms are doing precisely this, in my opinion. And I view this as a feminized mode of collective action because it derives from the repertoire of social skills that are historically associated with female subjectivities. And this mode of action certainly signals a change in the idea of activist achievement as well, because it challenges the hegemony of large-scale accomplishments, mass mobilizations, and rationalized organizational agency, etc., which had been seen as the sole criteria of a social movement's success, right? I mean, a social movement is deemed successful if it manages to affect change immediately, if it manages to organize mass mobilizations, and if it fails to do so, it is usually seen as a failure. But I think this is about to change, because this is not how you affect change in today's precarized, feminized world of work. And I was able to detect such a turn within two contemporary academic labor movements that Elena actually hinted at the beginning. One of them is the new faculty majority in the US, and the other one is the Network for Decent Work in Academia in Germany. And I think both movements seem to resist the dominant paradigm of generalizable outcomes and underlying masculinist doctrine of productivity. And as such, I think they represent a feminized, that is, counter masculinist and counter hegemonic form of resistance. Maybe it would be useful to give a little information on the movements. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the new faculty majority in the US or with the Network for Decent Work in Academia in Germany, but okay, let's give a little background information. The new faculty majority in the US actually emerged as the advocates of the non-tenured new faculty majority. This is where the name comes from, because adjuncts are the new faculty majority in the United States. They constitute about 75% of the entire academic workforce. So they are literally the new faculty majority. And they have no contractual or legal job security. So new faculty majority as a movement came as a response to that. They first started out in listserv around 2009, if I'm not wrong. Then they managed to create a real community, and right now they consist of two different affiliated organizations. One of them is a nonprofit membership organization, which is called the National Coalition for Adjunct and Contingent Faculty. And the other one is a public charity, which is the New Faculty Majority Foundation. So it's a very broad movement with different aspects, I would say. At times it seems to be dormant, but as far as I know, they have been active in supporting adjunct organization and, campus-based protests over the last years. The other case example, the Network for Decent Work in Academia in Germany, on the other hand, has a different structure. It's a nationwide network of precarious researchers. It emerged in early 2017, and its specific target was the fixed-term academic employment law in Germany, which basically terminated people's careers by limiting the temporary employment phase in the postdoc period with 6 years, which said like you either manage to find a permanent job within 6 years after finishing your PhD, or you're out of the system, which is ridiculous because there are no tenured jobs enough to absorb the huge supply of, qualified labor force in academia in Germany. So it factually terminated people's careers. And I guess this is what it aimed at since the start. That was like the undeclared aim of the entire law. But anyway, so the Network for Decent Work in Academia emerged as a response to that. And it's aimed to connect individual local initiatives that were forming at different campuses in Germany. And, they became this huge representative of the academic precarious in Germany. And by now, the network comprises like over 30 local campus initiatives across Germany. It comprises 2 trade unions and several federal level interest groups and disciplinary associations and so on and so forth. It's a loose structure. It's a very horizontal structure, but they have a coordinative circle that coordinates, nationwide protests and also does, identity construction work. They basically created the academic precarious in Germany as a political actor. So I analyzed their organizational structures and modes of action, and I was able to identify a tendency of feminization at 2 interrelated levels. First, at the level of organization and subjectivation, and second, at the level of tactics and outcomes. At the level of organization and subjectivation, I would say in both movements, the moment of subjectivation and organization overlap and they proceed simultaneously, which is untypical if you think of conventional, traditional labor organizations. And this has basically 2 implications in terms of feminization of resistance. On the one hand, it means there's no hierarchical professionalized labor organization. And this automatically erases the dichotomy between, the typical organizing cadres versus activists, or leadership versus follower, or liberator versus liberated, and so on and so forth. All these binary oppositions that you have in traditional labor movements, and that are based on an idea of rationalized, impassionate, strategic leadership, which is a very masculinist conception in itself. So this duality between politics and emotions that had been inserted by the masculinist paradigm of resistance is a Cartesian duality. And I would say that these movements are actually either willingly or accidentally challenging these dualities that we have. And these dualities have been widely criticized by feminist, queer, and post-colonial studies so far. But this is probably, the last decade has probably been the first time that we have seen its reflections in academic labor activism, and which is very exciting, I think, because of course, in a quantitative sense, the entire discourse of labor activism is still very much under the influence of these Cartesian dualisms, but at least in practice, we are seeing a change or a discursive shift. And contemporary precarious researchers' initiatives certainly challenge this. First of all, I think they acknowledge that the emotional implications of precarious work are at the root of both individual politicization and at the root of the formation of solidary workplace communities. And adjunct advocacy is highly attentive towards the subjective impacts of precarity, which are usually not in the radar of traditional labor organizations. And this can be seen, for example, in a way, the Network for Decent Work constantly emphasizes social reproductive concerns, health issues, and anxiety in academia. It has also been the case in new faculty majority activists' efforts to empower one another and overcome their own work status related timidity, as they describe in their anthology of experiences. And these are pretty therapeutic and affect-oriented collectivity building methods that you cannot expect from a trade union, for example, right? This has not been the way labor activisms function so far. And second, I would say sentiments and subjective experiences of precarity also shape activist tactics and the understanding of achievement in general to a great extent. For example, a central strategy in precarious researchers' initiatives has been to underline the shared aspects of work-related emotions and anxieties. We have seen, for example, in the case of this recent Twitter action in Germany that we had, the hashtag Ich bin Hanna, which aimed at making visible the experiences of temporarily employed researchers. And we have seen during this Twitter campaign, which made huge waves, by the way, in the German academic discourse, we have seen how actions often reflect an ethic of caring through sharing, like how actors supported one another by sharing experiences and expressing vulnerabilities. And they didn't do this only because everybody needed to vent, but they also wanted to protect each other from, stigma and other possible repercussions of activism. They kept sharing their experiences on Twitter in order to support one another and show, hey, we are many. So if you attack, I don't know, Elena for sharing her own experiences in the workplace, you will have Aslı in front of you who's, telling you a similar story. And if you attack Aslı and Elena, you will have Agata in front of you, or so on and so forth. So, and within a very, short period of time, you had a huge string of tweets, like, I don't know, 45,000 or 450,000 tweets within a couple of days, like telling stories about precarity and disappointment and mental health issues in academia and mobbing and workplace misconduct and shit. Like, it became this huge thing, and it propelled the issue of academic precarity to a plenary session of German parliament, which was a huge success in itself. I mean, if you have as the main criteria this outcome-obsessed masculinist conception of achievement that says, okay, either you change the fixed-term academic employment law or you fail as a movement. Of course, this is an incremental success because they weren't able to change the law, but at least they propelled the issue to the general public discourse, which is not a small achievement, especially in a very conservative academic structure as Germany. So I would say it's a genuinely care-oriented form of activism. And in feminized, affective modes of resistance, collectivization of emotions and vulnerabilities is not only a tactic, it's an aim in itself. And in a system based on what Zygmunt Bauman had called the individualization of misery, this shift in the nature of comradeship can be seen as an achievement in itself. There may be two things, though, that we should be careful about, because I catch myself sounding too optimistic, and I don't like this. I love being pessimistic and just depressing people. So I have to remind you that, I mean, these movements are based on loose structures, and their intended outcomes seem less defined as compared to traditional workers' organizations. And this may, first of all, threaten the permanency and endurance of the movements. Like, these movements tend to be more short-lived in comparison to trade unions and labor parties, of course. I mean, at the end of the day, these are very flexible collectives. Their functioning relies solely on volunteer work, and volunteers' capacities, willingness, life situations, etc., are themselves very precarious, right? I mean, these are people who are working on temporary contracts, have a lot to deal with, have also, anxieties and stuff, and they are volunteering to do this organizational work as well with very limited resources, both mentally and financially and time-wise, like temporarily. And, when people lose their jobs or have to move to another city or even country, we are hyper flexible in the 21st century academia as it is, or people have to prepare a new proposal for funding, which takes immense time and energy, or they have like 2 or 3 adjunct lectureships per semester that completely drains them and leaves them no time to do anything else. And boom, like they're suddenly unable to contribute to the activist struggle and energies are lost, right? And when this happens to a few active comrades at the same time, the entire movement might lose its dynamism for a second at a very critical moment. And the danger is real. I mean, we have been facing this in the Network for Decent Work in Academia, but at the same time, this flexibility can also be a good thing because other initiatives can emerge when certain collectives dissolve, or other directions can be taken, other people can jump in, cadres and strategies can adapt more easily to changing conditions, and so on and so forth. So it goes both ways, actually. And a second point that we need to be careful about is if we emphasize the affective and solidarity aspects a little too much, we may end up accepting every expression of work-related discontent as labor activism. Like, we may end up diluting the concept altogether. Does, for example, complaining to one another about work or just huffing and puffing on your desk count as labor activism? Of course not. These can only maybe constitute the starting kicks that might provoke activist energies at best. And also, if we accept everything as resistance, we may discredit real infrastructural work done by active contingent advocacy groups and networks, or we might do injustice to those who really do the groundwork in real action campaigns, right? Not everything counts as resistance. So we should be very careful about that. And we should not get too carried away and become too self-celebratory or see affective activism as a solution to everything, which is not. But it may be a step towards reclaiming the very effective qualities attributed to the feminine, which is systematically exploited in the neoliberal world of work. And we might start using them against this very exploitation. And again, I would say it is true that advocacy groups and networks and solidarity initiatives usually tend to be susceptible to circumstantial blows more than established workers' organizations. They are inclined to flicker and fade more easily than traditional labor parties and trade unions. And in terms of leverage, they usually do not possess the capacity to organize confrontational, combative forms of action, such as strikes or boycotts that have proven to be more effective in terms of achieving intended outcomes. But at least, again, as I said before, they have proven valuable in creating visibility and changing the discourse, which is not unimportant. 10 years ago, you wouldn't even hear the word precarity in the context of academic work. Up until very recently, that is, until the Network for Decent Work in Academia in Germany or other temporarily employed researchers networks in Spain, Italy, Portugal, Denmark, US, or the UK drew attention to the miserable situation in academia, you could still hear all those white old male professor dudes saying nonsense like, when I was doing my PhD during the second ice age, I was working on a fixed term contract too. As if it's the same thing as people in their late 40s doing their umpteenth short-term postdoc. They could not even grasp what academic precarity was until these movements changed the discourse. Whereas you now have the American Association of University Professors publishing statistics on adjunct labor. You have the German parliament organizing plenary sessions to address fixed-term contracts in academia. You have even OECD publishing policy papers on how to reduce academic precarity. So these are actually important steps. Of course, to improve working conditions or to increase basic funding to create more permanent positions, we need more leverage, we need more legal protection, we need more combative modes of action. But until that happens, feminized resistance compensates for the lack of unionized struggles. And more importantly, it challenges the hegemonic masculinist paradigm of productivity that had colonized our understanding of both labor organizing and academic production. So this is basically what I wanted to say about feminized resistance in academic labor activism, and I would be happy to hear your comments or questions if you have any, and thanks for listening to me.